Welcome back, everyone. It's great to be with you again. I want to mention with Solomon for one more day. Yesterday, I mentioned the transition of the throne from David to his son Solomon, and then after that transition, we talked about Solomon's prayer for wisdom that then led not only to that great wisdom, but to the riches and the power that were seen in Solomon's kingdom. All of that in time was then used to achieve a goal that Solomon's father, David, had never himself been able to reach. This is out of the 6th chapter of 1 Kings. It tells us that in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. Now it goes on from there to talk about a lot of details of the temple itself. And then moving on to the 11th verse, it says, "The word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this house that you are building, if you will walk in my statutes, obey my ordinances, and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will establish my promise with you, which I made to your father David. I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people, Israel." Now, some of you will recall the story of Moses and Joshua, where Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt and through the wilderness, but it was actually Joshua who was the one to lead the Israelites on that final crossing of the Jordan and into the promised land. It's a similar story that plays out here with David and Solomon. It's David who brought the kingdom back together under his rule and established Jerusalem as the heart of the land of the people of Israel. But even though David wanted to, it was actually Solomon who was given the privilege of being one to build the temple of God. Now, as you read on in 1 Kings, you can see all sorts of things about the size, detail, and furnishings of the temple, the story of its dedication, and all sorts of other things. But for me, what stands out in the midst of the lives that we lead today is the drive to build that temple in order to have that place in which God would dwell in the midst of the people. Think back to the Ark of the Covenant that had been carried with the people of Israel as far back as that wilderness journey. The priests carried that ark everywhere the people went as a constant reminder of God's presence among them. It was, for them, the way in which they were distinctly making room for God to dwell with the people. Now that the people had settled in this land, however, and that Jerusalem was the heart of that land and the heart of those people, they no longer needed or intended to be the nomads of days past. They had a home. They had a kingdom. They weren't going anywhere. So if the people didn't need to be portable, neither did the place they made for God. Thus, the temple. David and then later Solomon wanted to create a permanent home for God as firmly established in their land as they were. Now, again, you can look at all sorts of details if you want, but the striking element for me is the fundamental intent of making sure that there was room for God in the midst of the lives in which they were living. And that, I suggest, is where the story echoes to that which we know today. I would argue that in these days in which we live, we are in many ways as distracted as ever. We may not be rushing from one place to another as much as we were, but I don't think that changes the mental blinders that have a tendency to overtake our consciousness right now. Some of us find ourselves working harder than ever as we try to do the same work with fewer efficiencies in place. Some of us may be working the same jobs in the same ways, but doing so with more hindrances and frustrations and worries than before. Some of us may be at home, but that time away from work may be causing us even greater worry and consternation about finances, well-being, and so much more. I could go on and on with the many faces of the reality, but the reality is that we as a people are as distracted as ever. And our COVID-19 blinders are as capable as anything of turning our attention away from the presence of God right at the moment that we need it most. And that, I think, is the value of the story of the temple. Now, I'll admit that to some extent, I'm preaching to the choir here. Those of you who are taking the time to watch these messages are already a step ahead in finding ways to create that place for God in the midst of your distractions. So I'm not really encouraging you to do anything that you aren't already doing, as much as I'm encouraging you to continue to, and perhaps even more so, do that which you have already been doing. Build your temple. Of course, I don't mean in any physical ways. I'm not suggesting that we should be putting shrines up in our homes, but we need our temples. We need our places for God. We need our reserved spaces in our schedules, in our minds, and in our hearts that will pull our attention back from the distractions and remind us of God's presence among us. It may be a certain time of day. It may be a certain thing or things you do each day. It may be a place where you set yourself aside at home for a bit of time to come in prayer. The options are limitless, but the need is there. Follow that intention of David and Solomon, that conviction to create a place for God. Build your temple, your place and space for God in the midst of the distractions. And in doing so, allow God to come back to you with the same response he had for Solomon. If you make room for me, you will find me there. Let's join in prayer together. Loving God, help us to set our sights ever more fully on your grace, your love, your very presence in our lives. Circumstances distract us, God. The worry and fear pull our attention away. The ever-changing world around us blinds us, blinds our hearts from the peace of your work among us. So as we find our places for you, God, help us to see anew the very wonders of your works in our everyday. For we pray it in his name. Amen. I pray you all have a blessed afternoon, and I will see you back here tomorrow at noon.